Order, order. I've always wanted to say that. Look, it's wonderful to have so many people joining us this afternoon for this webinar and for this really fascinating session. Back in 2002, the Conference of the Parties of the CBD adopted a strategic plan, and their mission was to achieve by 2010 a significant reduction of the current rate of biodiversity loss at the global, regional and national level. And that was their contribution to poverty alleviation and the benefit of all life on Earth. That's what they said back in 2002. In 2010, the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 20 opened with these words: noting with concern the conclusions of the third edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which confirm that the 2010 biodiversity target has not been met in full. And then it went on. And there, of course, they set out the Aichi targets, which were going to have to be delivered by 2020. Now, the zero draft of the CBD for COP15, which, as you know, should have been taking place this year, the Convention on Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, which will now take place next year in Kunming in China, says this: biodiversity is deteriorating worldwide, and this decline is projected to continue or worsen under business as usual scenarios. So we've seen almost 2 decades of effort. And now what we have in the zero draft that has been produced, it actually says the objective is that the trends that have exacerbated biodiversity loss will be stabilized in the next 10 years by 2030 and allow for the recovery of natural ecosystems in the following 20 years, with net improvements by 2050 to achieve the Convention's vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. I don't know how all of you feel about this, and I want to hear what our panelists feel about all this. But I look back on the past 20 years and the consistent failure. And when I see the world in the form of the CBD, the nations of the world, pushing this ever into the future, so that in the next 10 years, we only hope to do stabilization, what we were supposed to have done by 2010. It doesn't fill me with hope. It doesn't fill me with real sense of urgency that we need about this. So today is about how we can get that sense of urgency. And we've got a fantastic group of panelists lined up. Before we go to them, I'm going to pass you to Jason as the secretary of the group, so that he can just do some housekeeping rules and let people know how they can ask questions, how they can be interactive in the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon. So Jason, can I just pass over to you?
Thank you very much, Barry. Welcome everyone, thank you. I'm sure you're all aware of the group as you're here, so I won't go into the background to the group, but obviously we plan to host a series of events and activities to raise the awareness of nature and biodiversity and extend that reach into Parliament. One of our objectives is also to extend that reach as much as possible. So for example, with today's event, we're recording it and we will post that online and also write a short highlights note for that, and that'll be circulated then next week to attendees, members, and those on the mailing list as well, with a link to the full video. Just a thanks as well to my colleague Amber Connett. So we at SIEM run the Secretariat, but my colleague Amber does pretty much all of the work for it. So thank you very much to her. If you are interested in joining the group as a member, that is a possibility. And if you go to the website, cieem.net/APPG-for-nature, or if you just search APPG for nature, there's more information there. In terms of logistics for today, please do feel free to ask questions. It'd be really great. We're going to have some presentations from each of the panelists, but then it'd be really great for us to get into a conversation and a discussion with some questions from you. We will prioritize parliamentarians. So if you can make sure in your name, if you put in questions, so we can pull you out first, that would be great. And please do feel free to use the chat for comments and to talk amongst yourselves as well. Thank you very much. Back to you, Barry.
Great, thank you, Jason. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, and that's Kate Cole. She is one of the most endangered species that is known in the world at the moment, and that is a local government ecologist. She's in fact representing the Association of Local Government Ecologists, and she's from East Sussex County Council. So Kate, how does it look at the grassroots?
It's fun. It's a challenge. The current pandemic comes at a time when we're already facing climate and biodiversity emergencies, the extent of which arguably outweigh the pandemic. We need to manifest the commitment and investment that's being made to help us recover from COVID-19 to address these climate and nature crises. A green recovery isn't about putting the environment ahead of other considerations. Rather, it's ensuring it's considered throughout the recovery decision-making and action planning to ensure that it doesn't delay or reverse our environmental and climate change commitments, and it makes the most of opportunities. The behaviour changes we've seen through lockdown, so remote working, sustainable travel, local purchasing choices, we need to harness these so that the population can continue to consciously contribute to the net zero target. This renewed connection of people with the natural environment demonstrates a groundswell of enthusiasm and, more importantly, support, both from the public and businesses, to protect and improve our green spaces and public access to them. The Association of Local Government Ecologists, or ALGE, knows that local authorities will play an indispensable role in accelerating clean, green and just economic growth. We've got unique knowledge of local communities, businesses and places and their service delivery and regulatory functions. However, we also know that only a third of planning authorities in England have access to their own in-house ecologist, and ecological capacity is spread thin across a wide policy agenda. That doesn't diminish the ambition and aspiration to deliver green recovery at the local level, and where we can, we're doing this often in partnership through local nature partnerships. So what are our asks to central government? Ensure local authorities have sufficient powers, resources and expertise devolved to the local level to make healthy, thriving places. Implement a new sustainable land use and farming system that restores nature and delivers net zero farming through the Agriculture Bill with sufficient funds and access to the new Environmental Land Management Scheme. Increase funding for local authorities to support landscape scale habitat creation and enhancement, working in close collaboration with wildlife and community groups. Biodiversity net gain and net zero carbon planning and development that protects and enhances nature through a stronger biodiversity duty on local authorities. Reform the planning system and revise the NPPF to provide greater priority to protecting and enhancing green spaces and infrastructure to support community resilience and climate adaptation. Ensure local plans provide access to quality nature-rich spaces within 5 minutes walk from home. So these are the Natural England's ANCST standards. Establish as a matter of urgency a national working group for the environment to include ALGE, LGA, DEFRA and professional bodies to identify the skills and expertise required to deliver the 25-year environment plan. Ensure local authorities are fit for purpose and have sufficient guidance on new approaches, including biodiversity net gain and net zero carbon, adequately skilled staff and access to training for elected members. And don't downgrade protection afforded to protected species and habitats in a bid to promote growth. Where local authorities do have ecologists, they're often experienced, passionate and determined to see these aspirations delivered. And we will continue to work with partners to accelerate the achievement of net zero carbon and the successful delivery of the 25-year environment plan through the Environment Bill.
There you go. I did what I advised all of you panelists at the beginning not to do, and that was to start speaking when you had unmuted yourself. Typical. Thank you so much. You've really set out a list, a wish list in one sense, but a very important list of demands for what government needs to do and the way in which government needs to work with local authorities to make sure that the aspirations that they have and the legislation that's coming forward, both in the agricultural bill, the environment bill, can be implemented and held to the letter of their aspiration. So it's a really, really useful ground level place to start. If we can turn now to our second speaker, Stephanie. Stephanie's Managing Director of RSK Biocensus Limited, and she chairs the Chartered Institute's Strategic Policy Panel. So I don't know whether that means that I'm not going to be able to understand what you're saying, Stephanie. It sounds too high level for the likes of me, but I hope I'll manage to keep up.
We'll give it a go, Barry. Okay, well, the 2050 vision then of living in harmony with nature, we can all sort of appreciate what that means, but how do we actually get there? To live in harmony with nature, we need to understand and respect the goods and services that the environment provides for us, and then husband them accordingly. Now, this affects everyone. It affects policy right across government. It's not a DEFRA issue that's about environmental policy. It's a government-wide policy about everything we do, and everything that society chooses to do needs to be held up against that standard of, are we living in harmony with nature? And if we're going to do this, if we're going to do it effectively, we have to harness the private sector. Businesses need to understand their risks and dependencies associated with biodiversity, what services from nature they require and use, and what their impacts on biodiversity are, and how those impacts on biodiversity go on to affect climate change and go on to affect the third of our current triumvirate of emergencies, social inequality and poverty. So we need to talk about mainstreaming biodiversity assessment across all of the decisions that we make in society. We talk a lot about mainstreaming biodiversity assessment. I talk a lot about mainstreaming biodiversity assessment, but actually before we can mainstream it, we need to actually streamline it. There's lots of initiatives, there's lots of badges and stickers and things that businesses can use to signal virtue in this area, but we don't have a comprehensive set of measures, indicators, protocols, KPIs, or generally accepted accounting principles that are available to measure how businesses affect, well, frankly, lots of aspects of natural capital, but certainly biodiversity. And we need that. We need it as a matter of urgency. Businesses are open to doing this. Smart businesses that we work with know that they rely on biodiversity and that there are risks associated with that for them. Their very survival could depend on the supply of natural capital. Businesses don't like unquantified risks. Shareholders don't like surprises. And we need to move fast. We've got less than 10 years to solve this. And it will mean big changes in how we do business, but far better to identify that now than to collapse in 10 years' time. So to stimulate the green recovery, we need to do this. We need, and that in making that happen, we'll create jobs in sustainable finance, in re-engineering business processes, and in assessing companies' impacts effectively on biodiversity and advising on how to mitigate and compensate and offset those. So the key for me in resolving both of those issues, one of the keys, is truly understanding about making space for nature. It's 10 years now that we've been talking about how we need to make our network of protected sites bigger, better, and more joined up. We need to actually make progress on that. We need a significant increase in the size of our protected area network. We need to improve their condition. We need to improve their protection and how they're managed. And we really need to make better linkages for them. We can't leap to simplifying licensing and simplifying the planning process without the associated need for big strategic protection of nature schemes. This will deliver green jobs. We need to put effort into delivering green jobs, green training, green education in order to deliver this. We've talked about the lack of local authority ecologists. There's been a reduction of the scale of staff and skills within some of the SNCOs and regulators, and we need jobs on the ground to actually deliver this. We need to start at the grassroots level. We need to start with education about nature at the earliest years of education and work up from there. And we need to reach out into all parts of society. My profession in ecology is quite a middle-class white profession, despite everything that we've been doing as an institute to try and counter that. But it's important that we are more diverse, because we need people across the whole of society to recognise how biodiversity is important, because if you don't recognise it's important, you won't fight for it, and really we need to fight for it. Thank you.
Stephanie, thanks very much. I just wonder, given what you said about you know, the Lawton report, making space for nature and bigger, better, more joined up, and how we've been talking about it actually for more than 10 years, because John Lawton was talking about it before the report. You know, why don't we have a statue to John Lawton somewhere? Because he nailed it. And so many of us have just been repeating what he said and trying to get that message out for so long now. Yeah. Martin Harper, he's the Global Conservation Director at RSPB, known to many people in the House of Commons. Many of the MPs have come across him in various seminars and lobbies that RSPB have done over the years. Martin, great to see you again. Please give us what is, because you're no longer just a bird organization, you're a global conservation organization, and you have that overview. So, you know, you're looking at goldfinches, you know, southern albatross, the whole gamut of biodiversity and the way in which those interrelations happen. And so we're moving very programmatically, I think, from the very local through the less local with Stephanie to the international with you, and then we go to Mike with the overseas territories, where we're really focusing on that. So it's a great sweep that we've got going here. Martin.
Great, thanks, Barry, and good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here. So I think the one thing I would add to Barry's introduction is just to remind ourselves that the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services suggested that unless we take action now, 1 million species will be at risk sort of within our lifetime. And that's the scale of risk we're talking about from a nature point of view. And of course, unless we keep global temperatures within 1.5 degrees, then we're going to be risking catastrophic climate change. And both those reports essentially highlighted the need for us to transform our economies, our food and our energy systems. And that's the scale of the challenge. And what they basically said, we've got to start now. What I want to do in my 2 minutes and 50 seconds is really to talk about a challenge, the opportunity and the jeopardy in the context of COVID and the changed world that we now live in. And so the challenge, I think, is it starts with the Global Convention on Biological Diversity and indeed the emerging global framework plan, which we hope will be agreed probably now May next year in Kunming in China. It was of course delayed like COP26 on climate change as a result of the pandemic, but we do need to maintain the momentum between now and then. Now, you might think, well, honestly, you know, what has a UN convention really got to do with applied conservation, you know, the likes of which Kate's talking about earlier? It is absolutely essential because it provides that strategic context and the ambition for us as a nation and indeed for the world. And as we leave the European Union, the importance of these global conventions actually increase. So the challenge is to make sure that what comes out of the Convention on Biological Diversity conversations is essentially right. And the 3 components we need to make sure are right is the ambition, the accountability framework for nations, and the financing. And very briefly, I'm sure this will come up in questions. So ambition needs to reflect sort of real world outcomes in terms of reducing extinction risk, restoring species abundance, and also maintaining habitat integrity, but it must also address the drivers, the good drivers like protect areas, but also the negative drivers such as unsustainable agriculture. And so we've got to get the targets right in the plan. The second thing we've got to get right is the accountability, because unless we've actually got a means of holding nations to account, then actually it's just going to be words. But we're talking really about soft law. And I think the thing that we've learned from the Climate Change Convention is that we have a consistent, standardized way in which nations report on progress in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. We haven't got that yet for biodiversity, and therefore we have no real means of comparing how well different nations are doing. So we've got to get that right. And the third thing we've obviously got to do, and of course this is challenging given the fact we're about to face a global economic crisis, is the financing. But unless we've got the financing in place, we will not be able to save some of the most important places on the planet. So that's the challenge. Let's get the CBD right. The opportunity, and I am going to come back down to apply this at a national level, the opportunity is that the UK government has actually pledged not just to restore nature and generation, but to establish a groundbreaking environment bill which will enshrine targets in law. Now, that environment bill needs to come back to Parliament fast. It needs to be enacted before we leave the European Union, and then it needs to make sure that the targets reflect the ambition in the CBD. So at the moment, for example, there's a big call, quite rightly, for 30% of our land and sea areas to be well protected for nature by 2030. We want that target also to apply at the UK level, and at the moment, based on SSI condition, only about 5% of target is currently in good nick. So it's a six-fold increase. But that's the opportunity. We can be world leading on this. The jeopardy comes, and Kate and Stephanie were both very polite about this, the jeopardy comes is that as obviously politicians look understandably to get our economy moving again, they mustn't trample over really important environmental protections. And it was really disappointing, and indeed, it was maddening in a way to see the Prime Minister in his Build, Build, Build speech early this week, again, put newts in the firing line to say that the newt counting days delay in our system is a massive drag on the productivity and prosperity in this country. That is a fundamental mistake, to see that the protection of things that we hold dear and actually provide value to our society is actually a constraint. And there's 10 years of history here. So the jeopardy is that we can actually end up causing more problems by short-term decisions to get out of the economic challenge that we're in, whereas a more enlightened approach would make sure that our economic recovery helps us address the nature and climate emergency and drives action in the way that Kate and Stephanie were describing.
Martin, thanks very much. And really interesting to see the way in which your call for metrics and accountability links back into what Stephanie was saying about the need for that comprehensive set of measures. It's much easier if you're talking about tons of greenhouse gas. It's much more difficult when you're talking about progress in biodiversity. And that's what we need to get a handle on. And what both of you said about natural capital is absolutely the way that we need to be going about doing that. So great. Mike, the stage is set up for you. I'm waiting for you picking up on what they said about metrics and resource. And of course, pointing out that whilst 94, I think it is, or 95% of the biodiversity for which the UK is responsible is in the overseas territories, not actually in the UK itself, but only 5% of the resources, the money that we allocate towards biodiversity, goes to the overseas territories. And this is a huge problem. And of course, it's one which we have to accept responsibility for as a country at the CBD. So how are we going to square that circle?
Well, thank you, Barry. You know me too well, really. But for the rest of what I was going to say, just to remind people that the UK overseas territories and Crown dependencies are important elements of UK, as Barry has said. Their citizens are UK citizens, and their lands and waters are parts of UK sovereign territory. Although small in size and human populations, these territories hold some of the world's most outstanding ecosystems. And collectively, they hold a truly staggering amount of biodiversity, which has served to underpin sustainable livelihoods in the territories for many generations. For example, fishing, tourism, water supply, hurricane protection, and renewable energy. And in terms of endemic species, which of course are those which occur nowhere else, an estimated 94% currently, but probably more, of the biodiversity which UK is internationally responsible is in the territories rather than Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But the government spends several orders of magnitude less per endemic species in the territories than in Britain. The UK's territory status as UK territory means they are not eligible for most international grant sources. But unlike the similar overseas territories of other nations, nor are they eligible for most national funding. The UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum, desperately abbreviated UKTCF, or the Forum, is a charitable company since 1996 and following a decade as an unincorporated association. And we're the only organisation concerned solely with promoting good environmental governance and the contribution of biodiversity to the well-being of the people and natural ecosystems across all of the UK Overseas Territories and Crown dependencies. Our member and associated organisations include leading environmental bodies in the territories and several in Britain. And much of our work facilitates mutual assistance between these and other bodies, including government departments in UK and the territories. The biggest threat to conservation in the territories is being starved of funding. For example, there was an 85% cut in average UK government funding to UKOTs via UKTCF after the banking collapse of 2018. This was never restored, and in fact has been reduced further to a 100% cut in the most recent 3 years. There is, of course, a welcome but temporary major UK government programme funding marine conservation, but terrestrial conservation, on which most of the endemics depend, is being squeezed. There are a few large NGO initiatives, for example, by our colleagues at RSPB, addressing particularly invasive problems. However, the balance of UK government funding has been moving away from support from UKOT bodies and their supporting NGOs like ourselves, and towards UK government's own agencies. And these tend to have less knowledge or understanding of overseas territories, especially the needs of local bodies. So if we're to have any chance of making the best use of opportunities, this must change. To restore UKOT bodies and NGO bodies, which can benefit by securing the most cost-effective use of limited resources by using existing knowledge and the use of free skilled volunteers. And I look forward during the rest of this seminar to expanding on some of these aspects in relation to the sort of points that I know that Jason and his colleagues have identified for us. Thank you, Barry.
Mike, thank you very much. And in fact, that's generated quite a bit of chat on our webinar. You know, particularly I think when you were talking about the way in which the government has the responsibility for the overseas territories and the way in which it needs to be incorporated, the work that needs to be incorporated in the Environment Bill. I'm looking here at something that Kerry McCarthy said, saying that she asked Jacob Rees-Mogg about this at Business Questions today. Now, I think Jason's asked if Kerry wants to come in on this, and I'm not sure whether that's managed to happen. Jason, have you?
Yes, I can.
Can you connect Kerry?
Kerry should be there.
And possibly also John Randall, if you can connect John to put his questions as well.
Yep.
Okay, I can unmute. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Gary. Thanks.
I don't know what's happening on the video front because there's not the normal button to press to say that you want the video to be on. So I don't know if you can. So I mean, in terms of the Environment Bill, we had only just started before lockdown.
We can hear you, Kerry, but you're very, very faint. Can you be louder?
Shall I try and get, is that any better?
That's wonderful.
Yeah, the laptop's a lot closer now. Yeah, so the Environment Bill, we had 1 week's worth, we had some evidence sessions, but then we only had 1 week of actual committee before lockdown. And it seems pretty clear now it's not being brought back before the summer recess. So if you're looking at another few weeks of committee stage in September, then you've got to have a report stage, then it's got to go to the Lords, and then come back for the inevitable ping pong. And it's a very large bill, so there's bound to be things. You're getting very close to Christmas, but there are things in this bill that ought to be in place, like the Office of Environmental Protection. I know that they've been doing a little bit of scouting because it's going to go to Bristol, which is where I represent. I think done a little bit of scouting around for office space, but I just don't see how you're, even if you got the bill through technically, the things that are meant to happen under the bill aren't going to be all ready to go the new year. And I just worry, if you look at what has been said in the past week, you know, about the counting newts and the developers and, you know, environmental protections basically being an obstacle, whether that political desire, you know, so we know that the Environment Bill came about because of Brexit and because of the need to replicate the EU environmental protections. And we were always worried that there would be a watering down. And, you know, on paper, I suppose the other thing is with the 25-year plan, I think there's a report coming up very soon saying that it's 3 years into the 25-year plan, I think, and very little progress has been made on some of those key areas. So I don't know how worried we should be about the fact that, you know, obviously COVID was not of the government's making and the delay therefore wasn't of the government's making. But I worry about the situation that we've now found ourselves in as we approach the end of the year.
Yeah, Kerry, thanks. Look, I think you shared concerns that many of us have, and across the House in Parliament, and of course what you're saying about the Office of Environmental Protection. You could also link up not only the Environment Bill but the Agricultural Bill and what Kate was talking about in relation to ELM. And the new land management scheme, environmental land management, and how that's going to be implemented and the guidance for that, and how we simply don't know yet what the rules are going to be for that. So it's this sense of, you know, the aspiration is certainly there, and the rhetoric and the words are there, but we need to see it followed up with detail, and we need to see it followed up in you know, real toothed implementation and accountability. Is this a good moment, Jason, to bring in John Randall, who also wanted to put some questions to Mike, if John's on the call as well?
John is on now.
Great.
Hi. My first question, I have two, but they're short ones. The first one is to Mike, because I was just wondering what impact he foresees for UK overseas territories biodiversity post-Brexit. We're talking about the Environment Bill and all the rest of it, and he mentioned funding, but specifically that. And then one for you, Barry, and possibly Kerry, if he's still there, which is that I've always had the impression that, and probably even more so now, many MPs and peers are actually engaged in environmental issues, but not specifically on biodiversity. It seems to be not really as hot a topic as climate change and all the other things. They'll make reference to it now and again, but it's not really such a big issue. And how can we change that? Because actually, I think a lot of people out there, a lot of our electorate are really concerned about nature, but it doesn't seem to get talked about as much as the bigger issues, which are just obviously as important. There you are, that's it.
Thanks, John. That's I'm going to use chair's prerogative and say this goes straight over to Mike to give me a chance to think of an answer.
Thank you very much, Barry, and also John. The Council of Ministers of the Overseas Territories and Crown Dependencies, for which we provide a secretariat, actually considered this matter at their most recent meeting, and they agreed that the exit from the European Union will have a significant impact on many of the territories, some more than others. For example, Gibraltar, like Great Britain, Northern Ireland, is or was, depending on where you are now, within the EU. And as this ends, Gibraltar will be affected in the same way as Britain itself, but also face other challenges. These are related particularly to the way in which the environmentally and other damaging acts by, as they put it, a neighbouring country have hitherto been moderated most effectively through common membership of the EU. Now, ending that will necessitate increased diplomatic support from UK with associated costs, because the EU can no longer effectively mediate it, be on one side. So the Charity Environment leaders urge UK government to support, as a matter of urgency, the facilitation of Gibraltar's inclusion into other international agreements, which will help offset that loss. The other territories are not within the EU, but will suffer various problems, losing their status as overseas countries and territories, OCTs, of the EU. Getting to alphabet soup here. So as OCTs, the UK OTs are eligible to apply for various forms of funding from the EU, or were eligible, including major technical assistance, infrastructure funds, and environmental funding. Also the access to EU trade and information is a major economic benefit to the territories. And a substantial amount of direct funding also goes to the territories, this having major effects on the environment. And of course, Gibraltar received direct funding as part of the EU. I should just clarify, I was almost quoting from the ministers there, the trade benefits relate mainly to sustainably sourced products, and the strong EU market for that helps the territories' environments. And ways of addressing that loss of market are not that simple. I think it's probably also worth adding the other factor which I know some territories are concerned about, including Gibraltar, was that external safeguards ensure in some way against changing positions. In a 4 to 5 year term, a government, if it's on the wrong track, can do an awful lot of environmental damage. But to restore the environment takes many, many governments in time to change it, so some continuity is important. And if I could dare, Barry, just to touch very briefly on the point raised by Kerry, again, the ministers there had a view, and they were very concerned about the 25-year plan made, although it alluded to UK's responsibility for the territories, it made no mention whatsoever of the Crown dependencies and very few to overseas territories, a point that we made in our submissions to the Environmental Audit Committee. But in fact, the Environment Bill, which of course, as you said, is partly to implement that plan, of course, doesn't actually relate to the territories. Most of the bill relates to England or England and Wales. Some bits relate to the whole of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but explicitly don't apply to the overseas territories. So yet again, we're moving further away. And I think, although the territories would not want UK Parliament to be legislating on their devolved matters, the fact is that the UK does account internationally for these territories. And so some financial input into data gathering and indeed conservation actions would be relevant. And the UK government could then account, or set targets and account for its own performance, while it may not be able to set targets for the matters which are actually devolved. So it's really a question of whether the government wants to be global Britain or little England. And the evidence points one way rather than the other at present.
Martin, I can see you nodding at this, and please, our other panelists should feel free to jump in here. But did you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of additional thoughts. So that was really helpful from Mike actually to lay it out. And then the other thing that we've found in this period is, well, there's one thing about Brexit and one thing about the pandemic and the impact on the territories. So I think the other thing about Brexit was that there was going to be the potential for some of the European money to eventually be used in the overseas territories. Of course, that's essentially a lost opportunity now, so that's not going to happen. And the thing that we've been really worried about is some of the local partners that we work with on the territory, I'm sure Mike does as well, they're in real trouble as a result of the pandemic. So for example, Turks and Caicos, really dependent upon the income they get through tourism associated with their iguana program. That's just gone through the floor. And unfortunately, unlike the fact that we've been able to benefit from things like the furlough scheme in this country and other business grant schemes, they just do not apply there. And so we're doing what we can to try and support some of those partners. But I think Mike's bigger point is, does the UK want to take responsibility collectively for what's happening in the territories? If so, how do they provide the appropriate support with the in-country administrations? And it feels like there is a big gulf between what's needed and what's available, this is exacerbated at this point as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Stephanie, Kate, did you want to contribute on this?
I just perhaps pick up on this point about MPs being engaged with environmental issues or not. I think.
Can we respond to John's separately? I just wanted to see if we'd finished this discussion about the OTs before we move on. I hadn't forgotten John. John wouldn't allow me to. But and I see that actually Liz Milne has come in on top of what John said as well in the chat, which is really helpful as well. But was there anything you wanted to add to that more global perspective on what was being
No, I've got nothing further to add on the OTs, thanks.
Okay. No, okay, sorry. In that case, well, look, John, let me start off because it was a question that was addressed to me. In fact, the precursor of this group a couple of years ago was actually called the Biodiversity All-Party Parliamentary Group. And when we reformed the group, we called it the Nature, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, because we felt that people didn't understand adequately the term biodiversity, and it put people off. So it's absolutely right at the core of your question. How do we get people engaged? How do we ensure that they're making these connections? I do think that the whole discussion that there now is about natural capital is helpful in this regard, because it's forcing people to realize that if you're talking about the wealth of a country, you're not capturing that by talking about GDP. You're only capturing it if you actually understand that it includes all of the stocks and flows of our natural resources as well. And that's the basis of all economic activity. And so I do think it's helpful that the Treasury is now beginning to think in that way. But then we have to be able to explain to people and to make it current that actually it's the diversity that's so important. And I think it was Martin that talked about the IPBES report. You know, that report starts off, or is it the Desgupta report? I can't remember. I think it's the IPBES report that starts off by talking about in the 1950s when we had, I think it was 6,700 separate species of bees, and now we're down to something like 3,400 separate species of bees. Now, I mean, that is an extraordinary loss of diversity just within one, I don't know what they are. Are they phylum? Are they, you know, well, you know, but one animal that we call bees. So getting that across, and then getting people to realize the economic importance of that in terms of pollination services, and what happens if you don't have those pollination services, and the economic loss that you sustain through that in your farming, is one way of getting these ideas more current. But Stephanie, please come in now and to respond to what John and also what Liz was saying.
Okay. Well, I think really this is around this lack of understanding about what biodiversity is and how we interact with biodiversity. A colleague mentioned to me this morning that at Kate's organisation last year, the Association of Local Government Ecologists conference, Madeleine Moon was a key speaker, and she said that a large proportion, possibly the largest proportion of the mail that she receives as an MP, and many MPs receive, was around nature and its protection. So this pressure to care about nature and to be concerned about nature is coming up from the electorate. So I think a lot of MPs are engaged with nature. I think they do understand it at that level. So you know, in Gloucestershire, where I live, that's probably going to be about killing badgers. In Sheffield, it might be about street trees and so on. There will be issues to do with nature that MPs are very engaged with. But I think what we haven't managed to do, and we need to do more effectively, is drive that understanding about how biodiversity underpins everything, that it isn't just something that sits in DEFRA, that we can look at the biodiversity implications of an education policy, of a transport policy, of a taxation policy. And that's really, I think, where the level of engagement isn't quite as it should be, because it's such a complex topic that underpins our interactions with really everything. And we can't deal with climate change without thinking about biodiversity, but we're not managing to make those links properly just yet.
Just quickly on that, Barry, I mean, I think, Steph, you've really made that well. We are trying, clearly, as a bunch of NGOs, and obviously we have the Time Is Now lobby, 13,000 people, 250 MPs, all of that, trying to make sure that people, nature and climate at the heart of the recovery. But I think that what Steph's just said is so important, is that this is not straightforward. There is not a single tech fix. It's not a case suddenly you switch your energy supplies into renewables and suddenly your job done. This is about the nuts and bolts of building your ambition, your strategy, your policy, your financing, and your delivery infrastructure all the way down to that grassroots level of what's happening in Kate's local patch in terms of the way in which we're guiding good development decisions. I think that, and I'm not saying this just because Kate's on the line, I think that the last 10, 15 years has seen an erosion of core capacity to actually make sure that we have the right expertise influencing some of those judgments. And it clearly hasn't helped that every time something goes wrong with the economy, we want to play around with the planning system. But if the government wants to treat nature conservation as seriously as it wants to treat climate change, it needs to think as a whole, that ambition, the policy framework, the legal framework, the financing, and how it works on the ground. Interestingly, through the 25-year environment plan, they've actually got lots of the component parts. Through the environment bill, they've potentially got the direction of travel right. They've got to stick it together and they've got to make sure they resource it. And I hope that the likes of Kerry and others on this call are able to carry on using their voices in the way you do brilliantly to keep putting pressure on the government to make sure that happens. And we'll try and keep on rabble-rousing the public.
Could I just come in again to pick up that point about keeping it in the high profile of the biodiversity and the environment there, and also pick up a point I see that Kerry has made on the notes about species champions. We are actually in the process, and we would have been doing more of it had lockdown not happened, of expanding the species champions exercise to include the overseas territory and crown dependencies. And I'm sure if Kerry speaks to a fellow parliamentarian, John Randall, on here, then he should get an ear bent about that as well. So that is something which is active and ready to go. And I think another point about this, and again touching back onto the overseas territory aspect again, is that next year will be the 20th anniversary of the agreement between UK government and the overseas territories called Environment Charters, which is basically agreeing how to implement the various international commitments. A couple of years ago, the environment ministers from the territories suggested that British government might like to sort of have some celebration of that. And also to build on the review we've done periodically about implementation of that charter over the years, without funding, sadly. But they're still waiting a response from British government on this 2 years on. So a bit more enthusiasm, really. I mean, this is achieving things. We should say so, you know, and wave the many flags a bit on that regard. Thank you, Barry.
Could I just come in very briefly?
Please, yeah.
I think I completely agree. And working at a local level, you know, biodiversity or ecology, any of the ologies are often seen as a barrier to development. So, you know, we often spend a lot of our time sort of fighting our corner. One thing that we're trying to do outside the planning system, if you like, is trying to change our language, trying to change the way we talk about wildlife and biodiversity and encompass it into natural capital and everything that natural capital gives us, because that way we're gaining a bit more traction in terms of getting wildlife integrated into all sorts of strategies like transport strategies and local enterprise partnerships and things like this. But we are having to change the way we speak about what we think of as wildlife and nature in order to engage with other people.
Yes, I don't know if you remember that huge tome of Oliver Rackham's, and at the beginning he says, "We are wildlife. Like the primrose and the oak, we are wildlife." You know, I mean, it's typical Oliver Rackham, but it's wonderful stuff. I see Barbara Young's joined in on the chat, and Barbara, are you able to join us orally or visually or both?
I haven't a clue how to come in visually, but I think you might be able to hear me. Can you?
We can hear you now. Super. Yes.
Sorry, I was late arriving. I'm multitasking at the moment. I've been very interested in this thing that the Treasury is playing around with at the moment, which is a net, a zero carbon test for all government spend and investment. And I just wonder whether we could get them interested in a net biodiversity gain test for all government spend and investment, because, okay, that wouldn't pick up the private sector stuff, but there's a heck of a lot it would pick up. And if it is a twin crisis with climate change and biodiversity loss, we ought to be having twin measures to judge how successful government is in monitoring its own spend.
Yes, I don't know if any of our panelists know the detail here, or perhaps John or Kerry, some of the politicians with us. But my understanding is that under the planning dispensation, part of the Environment Bill is talking about having a net biodiversity gain as part of that process. Now, the question is, how is that going to work out? And what are the details going to be? And that, I'm afraid, I don't know, but I know it's in the ethos. And again, Barbara, it goes back to what Martin and others were saying at the beginning in their 3 minutes about accountability, about the importance of metrics that Kate was talking about and that Stephanie was talking about, this ability to measure what we're doing, and the Treasury are doing that, you're right, on climate change, but we need to get this embedded into biodiversity. Yeah, Martin, you're...
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts, Barbara, on this. I think the thing about carbon is that essentially you've got the carbon budgeting system, which government will be judged against in terms of whether it's on track to meet its, hopefully its reduction targets. And then alongside this, you've now got this assessment tool, which obviously is a way of assessing projects and making sure you mainstream thinking about climate change impacts in those decisions. I think that when it comes to nature, I think you would still need the both. You would still need to have what is your overall cross-government ambition in terms of restoring species, populations, recovering threatened species and improving the condition of habitats, for example. And that should be a cross-government ambition, which you report against annually to see how you're going. And then essentially the net gain measure, as Barry's outlined, is essentially a tool by which essentially you can guide development. Now, whether that you apply that to investments and what rules you apply that, I mean, that's a bigger thing. But the point I was trying to make is that it would need to be additional to that legal targets framework. And then I think you can have some conversation. I think that within the planning system, there's quite a lot of experience about how you work the mitigation hierarchy and how you can actually make net gain work. Within the investment system, there's, in a sense, how would you control that? How would you manage that? How would you get to set the standards? But others might be better placed to comment on that.
Grant. Barbara, did you want to come back?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I mean, we've got one major, overwhelming obstacle to overcome, and that is Mr. Johnson. I mean, the fact that he gratuitously threw in the newt remark just, fills you full of horror, really.
Yes, and of course, if we are going to have biodiversity gain as something that comes out of the planning process, or ecological gain, environmental gain, then perhaps it would be a good idea not to tell people the date on which we're going to bring it in, so that the Secretary of State for Planning doesn't get himself into trouble approving things, within the time period. But look, we're straying on to the more political than the ecological. There's an interesting question here in the chat from, I can only see Lou, I don't know how it finishes, saying, I'd like to know whether Kate and Stephanie have any thoughts about the arrangements of ecologists in different sectors, as various people have mentioned that net gain and using metrics is key, but evidence shows, and in particular with planning decisions for housing developments and infrastructure for biodiversity and carbon respectively, there are massive imbalances in expertise that enable good planning decisions to be made. Net gain and offsetting can simply replicate the political imbalances in the planning system. Kate, is that one initially for you and then Stephanie thereafter?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and it's something that I would say is very, very close to Augie's heart. As I said at the beginning, only a third of local authorities, possibly even less now, have their own in-house ecologist. And it's our role basically to try and advise on the planning system and what the ecological implications are. The range of information that we get when it comes to planning applications varies hugely. Something that Algie and Saeem are trying to do is raise the standard of the information that comes in so that it's very clear what are the impacts, what is happening, what are you going to do about it, how have you applied the mitigation hierarchy. But it's, you know, if you don't, it's quite a complicated process. And if a local authority doesn't have an ecologist, as long as a few buzzwords have been used in an environmental report, you know, it's quite easy for things to go through. So we're working as hard as we can to try and raise the standard of reporting so that we are getting good, sound ecological impact assessments done. And we are confident that not only is the mitigation hierarchy being proposed, but now we're sort of thinking about that biodiversity net gain as well. But that's a whole new area that we've got to get our heads around. And how do you measure a net gain in biodiversity?
Yeah. Stephanie, yeah.
Yeah, well, I would agree entirely with that. I think that it has been a problem we've been commenting on for a very long time now, but hopefully with the fund announced recently that and the aim to deliver green jobs as part of a COVID recovery, then we can direct that funding towards this as an absolute priority to increase the level of skill and the number of personnel available in local planning authorities and within the regulators who can advise on this and make sure that good decisions are made. When it comes to net gain, I think it's a great idea, the net gain metric, the DEFRA metric. I think it's a great idea, but we still haven't finalised the metric that's available. And so there are lots of different options around for people to use. You can slightly play tunes on the metrics to get the answers you want. People don't necessarily go with the best decision of what the right gain would be for a particular place, but go with what would be the cheapest thing to replace. And there's a lot of confusion around this. As we've mentioned, there's the lead-in period of 2 years before it actually becomes mandatory. It can do a lot of damage to biodiversity in 2 years, as we've seen. And then there's the confusion over, well, how long is this actually going to be in place for before we put a whole new system in place of environmental net gain and looking at wider elements of natural capital, which again is a good thing, but we're not sending clear messages out to users and out to developers as to what the system's going to mean to them. So I think we really do need to get very clear guidance, and Simon's been working on this and working on a standard for a net gain report so that it should be very clear what's being done. But if I can be allowed to just have a little hobby horse about this, at the moment, the guidance says that you should try to replace any lost biodiversity units as close as possible to the site of the impact. That's generally good advice. But if you can't, you can put it somewhere else and you'll get slightly less credit for what you do. Rather than just, if things are detached from the site of the impact and from the human communities that have suffered that impact, rather than letting people put things down randomly, shouldn't we be using that funding that's coming in from developers to drive some strategic gains for nature conservation? Shouldn't that be fed into nature recovery networks, into strategic rewilding projects, into much higher level plans that actually deliver to a plan the joining up the bigger and better that we actually need across the country?
Yeah, I just wanted to add in a comment that Liz has put on the chat here, which I think is very important when we're talking about net gain, and that is, of course, that the strategic infrastructure, the national strategic infrastructure plans, they obviate the requirement for net gain in that way. So that's a big lacuna in the system, and we need to, I think we need to challenge that at a political level, because we should not be exempting them from the same rubric. And I noticed that Andy Lester also has put up it is a question, but he says, I have a son who's been sitting with me and has said, I don't see anyone doing anything new. We've come out of lockdown where people were on their bikes and enjoying nature in an amazing way. They've now gone back to business as usual. I'm really worried that nothing has changed, and there's a lot of talk about change, but nothing new is happening. We're running out of time. How can we work together with the wider public to do something incredible? So, and if you link that back with what Martin was saying about the IPBES report, talking about transformative change across economic, social, political, and technological factors, which is what they call it in the Global Assessment Report, and the importance of seeing this as a transformative moment. I think Andy's son is really trying to get us to nail our colours to the mast here. How can we join together to do something incredible?
Sorry, can I jump in with 2 points? One bad and one good, I think. Just picking up the last discussion, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that several local bodies in overseas territories expressed great concern that their governments, in desperation at the loss of income from tourism, which is a main element of the economy of most of those territories, are basically moving towards encouraging built development and abandoning many of the environmental and planning safeguards in that. And it's difficult to see how that can be resisted without a very definite steer and possibly some help from the British government away from that direction. That's the bad one, and that's the warning we'll be careful of. The more positive one, in answer to Andy Lester's son, we have been trying to do something novel with our colleagues in several territories about getting the local population to take responsibility and empowering them to do so for conservation, including situations where you can't do it elsewhere. One very notable example is in Montserrat, which of course suffered the volcano a few years back, where we can't apply all the techniques we'd apply for restoration elsewhere, but we can actually hold the fort. For example, for fending out some of the invasive plants and saving the endemic creepy crawlies, amongst other things, by getting people to adopt pieces of land, whether their own or other people's, and manage those. We had a very, very successful pilot there, developing that, as have ourselves and others in other territories. Our big challenge is that though we can get a pilot funded, we can't actually get UK government to support building on that pilot, despite their marketing success. So that's although the last little bit is a little bit negative, that's a positive. There are people there who want to do things, even in very difficult situations, want to build. And I'm sure the same applies across much of Britain, as well as the territories I'm speaking of there. It's a very positive to be able to work on. So there are new ideas, they need nurturing and developing. Thank you.
Pilot schemes are supposed to lead you towards schemes. In fact, pilot seems to be an alternative word for temporary, because it doesn't seem to lead anywhere now. It should be leading to permanent funding. Yes. Martin, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, to Andy's son who's watching, I think we're still in the middle of this massive disruption. So I think that a lot can and will still happen, and hopefully for better than what we've had in the last few days. I think that there are some really interesting signs of some countries doing things very differently. So we're obviously aware in New Zealand where they've invested 1 billion New Zealand dollars and tens of thousands of jobs to try and help them not just get back to work, but also do good things for nature. It's not as much as we would like. It's not much saying, they're not saying much about climate change, but that's a really interesting intervention by government. Interestingly, in the States, just over the last couple of days, Congress has passed quite a big bill for quite a big rescue package, which will involve creating new conservation jobs. And even in the small print of the Prime Minister's speech this week, there was, it was small, but there was an investment for £40 million, essentially into shovel-ready projects, which will do good things for nature and hopefully the climate. So I think that in this period of disruption, we absolutely need leadership from the governments, because they're the ones who can provide the signals to the economy about the direction of travel that we're going in. And actually, we are going to be transforming the economy because obviously lots of sectors are in really deep trouble. So how do we provide those alternative forms of employment for people who are going out of, probably sectors which are going to struggle? And which is why, the NGOs have been calling for this National Nature Service idea to try and get jobs for people who are being out of work and get them skilled to actually be the new workforce of the future to help restore nature. So I think there's leadership in government, but I think you're absolutely right. The challenge back to all of us who interact with the public in a variety of ways is to help them make it easy for them to do good things. I've seen the Wildlife Trust do their brilliant 30 Days Wild campaign in June. We're going to be launching a new campaign, which is sort of Our World Now, which is all about trying to encourage people to really remain connected to nature, which is obviously what's happened during lockdown. And then I think it's all of our jobs to equip individuals to do really good things in their community, in their homes, in their lives, but still maintaining pressure on our political leaders to provide the big signals to deliver the transformation to the economy we need.
Jason, you were going to come in and do a little bit of a roundup of questions that I've missed, I hope.
Yes, I think we've covered most of them. I think most of them can be wrapped up into three things. One is public engagement in education, and there's been a comment around the GCSE on natural history. An interesting point about a lot of this relates back to positivity around the EU and are we alienating Brexiteers? A question or a comment around, do we need a single target for biodiversity, similar to the 2-degree target for climate change? That's an interesting one. And then a comment from Andy Lester as well, again, about how involving the church in public engagement is a really good point. So some things there around public engagement. And then government engagement, how do we engage government better? I think we've really covered a few of those things already. And then the last one, quite a lot around urgency and speed of action, as Martin mentioned earlier. But we've also covered that a little bit with Andy Lester's son's question, comment.
Very good. Who'd like to pick up on those?
I can pick up on the education and training one, if you like. Just to say, first of all, that we really welcome the GCSE in natural history that I hope will be available to students from 2022. But I think in order to get students interested in that and wanting to take that GCSE as an option, we've got to build it in really from early years. So we've got to build in that, the things that used to happen when I was at school, like you'd go on a nature walk and you'd have a nature table and you could talk about things like that, and you didn't necessarily have to have everything so neatly programmed in to a national curriculum as we do today. So we need to make sure we've got that flexibility to build in a love of nature as early as we possibly can with children's education, so that it is something that they care about. But in addition to that GCSE, we need to be looking at the A-level syllabuses, making sure that perhaps we could go back to the days when you could take zoology or botany as an A-level. We desperately need degree courses in botany and taxonomy, because those skills in actually understanding what it is we're looking at and how we're going to work, those skills still need to exist, and they're getting in rarer and rarer. We need research council funding for PhDs and postdocs on aspects of ecology and natural history. When I was a PhD student, I had to struggle to make it very plain that although I was working in ecology, what I was doing was science, it wasn't natural history. Natural history wasn't a respectable thing in the 1990s. And so I think we need to get away from that. We need to understand that understanding the natural world is actually valuable, in fact critical to our survival, and we need to get that back right the way through the education system. But as well as higher education, we need training at the jobs level, at a basic skills level. One of the projects that SIAM is involved in at the moment is working on qualifications for ecological clerks of works, so that we can get people in construction careers to have a slant of looking after nature and being involved in biodiversity as part of their jobs. People can learn that from on-the-job training in construction. And I think it's important to have those apprenticeships and routes in for early school leavers to be able to bring that sort of broader appreciation of nature conservation.
Great, thank you very much.
I don't mind doing the apex target one if you like, Barry.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah. So I mean, it's hard because counting and interpreting wildlife is a bit different to concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the RSPB, WWF and Wildlife and Countryside Link recently submitted a paper to Minister Lord Goldsmith trying to outline what we think are the key components that needs to be in place in the new global plan for nature. And in a sense, we're not there with the actual words, but we're essentially saying that the key ways in which you determine ambition is whether we are, WWF language, bending the curve and helping to restore nature by 2030, or on the path to doing it by 2030. And you measure that through a combination of species abundance, extinction risk, and quality and extent of habitat. That really is the way, as I say, we haven't got the words right, but that's the cornerstone of assessing whether we're winning or not in terms of the battle of restoring nature. There's been a lot of clamour to focus on the 30% by 2030 as protected area target, and we absolutely support that. But in a sense, that can't just be it, because it's a means to deliver in the end, and the ultimate test of what is happening to species. So we're working on it. We're thinking about the best way in which we can engage the public on this, because in the run up to Kunming, which is probably going to be in May 2021, we need all of the citizens of the world to be clamouring for high ambition, good accountability and good financing to actually make sure that what's agreed globally does then translate into nations around the world.
Very good.
Could I come in, Barry, on
Please,
this?
Mike, yeah.
I don't dissent from anything that Martin said there, but I think the other thing we need to bear in mind is the need to keep flexibility. We don't know enough to set so rigid targets, because other things happen, not just in the human world of COVID, but also elsewhere. For example, in the Caribbean at present, there's a bacterial infection which is killing at an incredible rate of knots the coral reefs. This is something which wasn't really known in the area a couple of years ago, and because the governmental systems are built into a rather rigid framework, dealing with this major threat, actually removing the reefs, is being left to small NGOs without support and doing it. So we need flexibility. We need to be able to react to these things which we can't predict, and not leave things which are not just important for biodiversity, but fundamental for the economy of these places to be addressed. So yeah, get these measures in, but also keep the flexibility to be alert to other issues.
I want to try and focus us at this sort of final stage of the discussion back on Kunming and the COP, and the way in which the Kunming COP must naturally feed into the Glasgow UNFCCC COP. And I mean, it may be, given all the sort of shenanigans that were going on at the CBD and the loss of the executive secretary at the end of last year, and the now new executive secretary, that actually having that year's delay will allow the CBD to settle down and get more focus as it goes forward to Kunming. But how do you see the zero draft being improved, if it needs it? Where does it need improvement? Where can we say, yes, this will work for biodiversity? And how should national governments be responding? It's very easy in terms of the UNFCCC to say, well, we make our NDCs, we've got our commitments, we know exactly what they are and they're quantifiable. And it's much more difficult to say within the context of the CBD how we're meeting the objectives that have been set. So moving into that space, can I get your thoughts on how practical the zero draft is, where it can be improved or needs improved, what are the political issues surrounding the COPs, and how do they merge into one another?
I don't mind kicking off, Barry, just to set the scene a little bit. And just to say, actually, the 0.5 draft emerged on Monday. So we've actually got an updated version, which the guys are looking at now. It's, for those of you who aren't aware, I mean, obviously we've had smart targets or in the Biodiversity Convention well, for plants since 2000 and then since 2010, the HE targets. And the idea is that they are meant to then try to be transposed into domestic ambition, and they're meant to be reporting on them every 2 years or so. And so, for example, in an English context, the government produced the England Biodiversity Strategy and tried to translate some of those metrics into their plans. So the way that they're designing the draft is essentially having 4 quite big sort of goals which relate to some of the things I was talking about around species and habitats, but also around implementation, and then 20 targets which really are sort of the action targets about how do you address the drivers. And at the moment, the outcomes are better than the action targets. And what we know it works is they need to be pretty specific. And they need to be measurable, and they need to be realistic, and they need to be timed. So we're working hard to try and make sure that there are clear metrics in those, because that then drives clearer accountability when, for example, nations like the UK report against progress. It needs to be clear whether we're on or not on track, and we can do that with carbon. So that's really important. I think it's worth saying that there was real attempts to try and make greater links between the 2 conventions, particularly over obviously the value of investing in high carbon habitats as a contribution to climate change mitigation. And interestingly, the UK government itself, when it hosts Glasgow COP for climate change next year, probably next autumn, they will hopefully still be seeing nature-based solutions as one of the really big themes, which is why I think, you know, the Conservative government created this Nature and Climate Fund, £650 million or so, and of course Scottish government has £2 million, or maybe £5 million, again going to peak resource. And I think that what we hope will happen is in the run-up to the Glasgow COP, the UK government is able to go to that COP having practiced what hopefully it will also be preaching, which is just saying it is possible to get the wins by investing in those high carbon natural habitats to deliver both nature restoration and also at the same time remove more carbon from the atmosphere. And they obviously need to have done the diplomatic work to make sure other states are on the same path on that. Now, I think again, Lord Goldsmith is currently talking to lots of organisations about an idea called the Nature Covenant, which I think is trying to get more states committed to investing in nature in a really big way, and that needs to complement work being done by other coalitions that are going on. The French, for example, play quite a big leadership role at the moment, and they're going to be hosting the IUCN World Congress perhaps in January this year. They've just said they're going to be having a public petition, a poll on whether to introduce ecocide, essentially to make damage to habitats a crime. And I think, therefore, one of the challenges for the UK government is to join up the diplomatic efforts of others, and of course China, to make sure that what emerges at the end of 2021 is a more cohesive plan which nations want to invest in. I'll stop there and allow other people to offer their thoughts.
I think that's really comprehensive. Can I just check whether any of our politicians still on the line, whether John or Kerry or Barbara, want to comment on the political situation with China at the moment, because we're seeing huge political tensions both over Hong Kong, over Ladakh and the conflict with India, the trade wars, how they think that might play into the negotiations and our ability to do what the CBD says is necessary, and that is to work together comprehensively on these issues. Any takers from our politicians?
Yes.
This is Kerry. I mean, China is, this came up during the...
I can see Kerry is responding.
My laptop needs to be there. So I was Shadow Minister for human rights and also for China in our SCO team for 4 years, and things have got a lot worse since then in terms of, you know, treatment of Uyghur Muslims, what's happening in Hong Kong in particular. And I was in the chamber for the Hong Kong statement this week, and you know, despite the sort of lip service that is, you know, with Hong Kong, I think it's a specific example because we have that UK connection and that responsibility towards the BNOs there. But on broader human rights issues in China, unless you have concerted international action, I'm not sure that, you know, I think there's a culture of impunity as far as them being, you know, if you look at Tibet, which is the most obvious environmental concern there, and the sort of the environmental degradation of the Tibetan plateau, you know, I can't really think of anything. I probably shouldn't have intervened because I can't think of anything positive to say in terms of being able to influence China on that. And I suppose if that feeds into the fact that they are hosting this conference, I don't know whether that gives a bit of a platform, a bit of leverage in terms of China putting its own house in order, but I suspect that's not really the way that China does business. But yeah, so I think all I can do is be cynical about it, really.
Yes. John, Barbara?
I think there's another complication, and that is, you know, we're moving hell for leather to try and get this trade agreement with the Yanks. And, you know, if we do go for that, we are going to upset Europe, and we're going to upset the Chinese in a modest way because we're very small and we can't really give major upset to anybody anymore. But, you know, if we throw our hat in the ring with the Americans, because of the polarization of the situation between America and China, I think we are going to find ourselves in a very difficult position in terms of our influence on the rest of the world. Yeah.
John, have you got any thoughts on this?
Well, a bit like Kerry, that I can see the problem. There's part of me wants to congratulate the Chinese on what they have been doing, which is good, creation of new wetlands. They're taking it very positively. However, having listened to a debate in the Lords the other day, listening to the human rights abuses firsthand, well, not firsthand, but detailed what's going on with the Uyghurs, never mind, as you said, Barry, Ladakh, and also Hong Kong, you begin to wonder whether we should be taking stronger action. But I'm no expert at all, but I do think when you're dealing with the Chinese, there's a different sort of diplomacy that's needed than it would be in my old, more specialized area, the Western Balkans. And I think we've got to work out what we want. There's some way of possibly trying to praise them for the good things they're doing. And we've got to also hold them to account on the other things. But the way it's going at the moment is actually, it's escalation all the time. And I could almost see people saying that we should be considering not taking part in some of these things, because the Chinese are going to be highly important also with the COP. And if bad things happen and the COP doesn't have China involved, then that's not going to be much of a COP at all, is it? It's going to be a cop out.
Yeah, look, I think all three have highlighted some very serious areas of disjunction that we have going forward politically, and the way the politics and the geopolitics will play into the politics of the COPs. I would say it hinges around two words. One is respect, and the other is face. And on the respect side, it's clear that China respects strength, and it has a very different approach to its own governance. It's a very different system, and it has a very different approach to the way in which it deals with the rest of the world. I think the way in which India has stood up to China very strongly on the military front in Ladakh, and before that I've forgotten the name of the other border skirmish. It began with a D. But that ability to command respect, whilst at the same time holding out the hand of trade cooperation, has by and large worked. It's a very tense situation there, but I think it's one which is working. And the word face comes in because, of course, the Chinese do not ever, the whole culture is against losing face. And I think because this is the first international COP that the Chinese will have hosted in Kunming, it's very important to them that it is a success. And I think that actually gives us the point of leverage, because they will not wish it to be a failure. They will not wish it to fail. And that enables us perhaps to leverage a response for the UNFCCC in Glasgow of cooperation there, exchanging cooperation for cooperation. But I think it has to be done with the respect there in the background. So I think these are really difficult political waters to chart our way through. In addition to all the complexities that we talk, the technical complexities within biodiversity and climate change and measurement and metrics and so on. Those are the internal political debates that will have to go on, but they're overlaid by these wider geopolitical ones. And I do think it's a very critical moment in terms of the geopolitics as to how we handle it. Now, we've got, I think Jason's going to tell me 4 or 5 minutes left. Is that correct, Jason?
Yes, until past.
Right. You've been keeping your eye on the chat, the webinar. Are there other issues that you think we should pluck out from those before I do a quick thank you to our panelists and to everybody else?
I think the one that's popped up, there's 2 here and it popped up earlier as well, is this idea of a single target for biodiversity around 20 extinctions per year, and there's been a little bit of chat on that, so it'd be interesting to get the panel's thoughts on that maybe.
Yes. How many extinctions are you prepared to countenance, panel?
0.
If you phrase it that way, it has a certain ring about it, doesn't it?
I think I need to
It's
declare a little bit.
to set a target for any number of extinctions. I mean, obviously, there is a kind of background rate of extinctions, if you like, of natural processes in some ways, but yeah, it seems a strange target to set for me.
Kate, you wanted to come in, I think?
I completely agree. It's, you know, if we're all people that are working in the environmental sector, how can we possibly set a target of, yes, I will accept that number of extinctions? It's just, it's not right.
We have to name our favourite species as to which ones work.
Yes, which one you'll keep.
So I mean, we haven't got enough time for the big debate on this, and I'm not the same. What I said before, in terms of you judge success based on abundance, reducing risk, and at the same time habitat integrity. However, it's worth noting, obviously, in the Climate Change Convention, they do sanction warming. And they basically acknowledge the fact that there will be warming, which will cause harm. So I think what the guys are trying to do with that paper was to say, how you know, what is the best way of sort of trying to really determine success or not? And I think extinctions actually on its own is inadequate. And of course, we all want 0 extinctions, but I think we have to be honest, we're already causing harm. There will be extinctions above the background rate. But anyway, we've got to end the debate. We've got to get the right ambition in the global deal and translate it into domestic legislation.
Okay.
And we should probably, if we can, just try not chop and change the targets too much in their overall nature, because then you can never tell whether you're doing better or simply hiding losses.
Yeah. It's a very old trick of governments to change the basis. Just an anecdote that I'm sure Mike's heard before. When I became Minister for Biodiversity back in 2006, the first thing that the officials in the department did was give me the badge that said 2010. And I said, well, what's the badge for? And they said, oh, it's the 2010 biodiversity target, Minister. I said, oh, that's great. What is the target? And they said, they actually said it's to halve the net loss of biodiversity by 2010. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. I said, so what was the rate of loss in 2000? And there was a deathly silence. And they'd never calculated the base figure, so they never knew if they were going to meet the target of halving it. It was just, I mean, crazy. But changing the basis upon which you do things is clearly a problem. Look, we've got a minute left. Can I just thank our panelists, thank our members of Parliament for joining us. I hope next time you'll be able to join us by being part of the Zoom, so you're in the visual as well. And thank you to all the participants who've put in questions for what I think has been a very stimulating debate. The Dasgupta review has said that nature's resilience is being severely eroded, with biodiversity declining faster than at any time in human history. In the past 4 decades, there's been on average a 60% decline in the populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. That's mostly in the tropics, but it is a phenomenon which this group and all of you, I know, are determined to address. And so thank you very much. I think we're going to be timed out very shortly. Order.
Thanks, Barry. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
I just thank everyone and thank Barry as well for chairing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.